Hey, good morning to everyone. I would like to talk about the relations among these four concepts: disinformation, post-truth culture, polarization, and populism. It's a lot to cover, and I can only touch on them all, but it's the overview that I think is interesting, and we'll see if I get to all of them. And I'd like to begin with a kind of an homage to Jürgen Habermas, who died this year, and an application of a key idea of Habermas to this problem of disinformation and post-truth culture. In his first book after the structural transformation of the public sphere, Habermas put forward a distinction between two kinds of human action, which he referred to as techne and praxis. Techne being strategic action that's oriented toward effective accomplishment of a certain kind of goal in the world, and praxis being communicative action oriented toward understanding among human subjects and the creation of social norms. And Habermas made an argument, which is a kind of an elaboration of a general argument of the Frankfurt School, that modern society was characterized by an imbalance between strategic and communicative action, in which strategic action tended to dominate, and the institutions of the market and the state that were oriented around strategic action tended to dominate over the institutions of cultural production centered around communicative action. So I want to apply this to the concept of disinformation and post-truth. So disinformation, why does disinformation circulate? There are various kinds of explanations for this. One of them, of course, has to do with social media, the algorithms of the platforms, and the displacement of the traditional gatekeeping institutions by these social media. And I think this is obviously an important part of the explanation, but not a full explanation. If you think of the example of COVID, for example, disinformation circulated, if you turn the lights off, then I can't read my notes, so unfortunately there's no light here on the podium. I don't know if there's anything we can do about that. Maybe I'll get by with this, let's see. So disinformation about COVID didn't circulate equally everywhere, even though social media exists everywhere, right? It didn't circulate in Norway or New Zealand or South Korea in the way that it did in the United States or Brazil. What is the explanation for that? Well, I think a second explanation has to do with the strategies of elites who in countries like the United States and Brazil interpreted the pandemic in terms of a political conflict between themselves and their opponents, and in the process of trying to win that conflict, made attacks on public health officials, journalists, and so on, attacks on the credibility of those actors. Those elites, which include here media elites, as you can see in the case of Fox News, were operating within what we often call post-truth culture. Here is, I think, a prime example of what we mean by post-truth culture. This is a story that has to do with, if you remember, during the election campaign in 2024, people associated with Trump's campaign were spreading a narrative about Haitian immigrants in a town in Ohio who were supposedly eating the pets, the cats and dogs of people. This was an entire fabrication, this story, and local officials urged the Trump administration to back off on it. And this is a story about J.D. Vance, who is defending their spreading of this narrative, not really by claiming that it's true, but by saying, as you see here, that they have a right to spread this narration, to create stories so that the American media actually pays attention. So he's basically making an argument that we evaluate this information not in terms of its truth value, but in terms of its political effectiveness. And this is a prime example of strategic communication. I think one of the most revealing, this is a very revealing title here of one of the prime spreaders of misinformation in the United States, this website now defunct called InfoWars, this idea that information is essentially a tool of war, a weapon of war, a tool of political struggle. This is what we mean by post-truth culture, and this is the direction that we've moved in a lot of our societies. And I would add here that one very important thing about consolidating this kind of post-truth culture is that it requires dismantling the institutions of independent knowledge production. So in the United States right now, we are experiencing very extreme attacks on the news media, the universities, and also all of the institutions within the government that are traditionally understood as producing knowledge that is available for the public as a whole, right, rather than serving the strategic interest of the ruler of the country. So this includes the Centers for Disease Control, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, various kinds of ombuds people and inspectors general in the various organizations. Let me check my time here. I want to add here that this, in terms of post-truth culture, that there was an argument, well, actually, I have one more slide here. Let me focus on this first of all here. I read an interesting article by a philosopher who was talking about Trump and post-truth culture, and the bizarre fact that Trump is constantly making claims that basically everybody knows are false, right? Like that prices are going down, or that he's solved all this long list of wars and so on. And he's reflecting on why it is that Trump does this. And he says, by resolutely asserting unbelievable falsehoods, Trump is expressing contempt. He is deriding the enterprise of journalism, in effect forcing reporters to write stories about his incredible statements, thereby indirectly controlling the news cycle. So what Tallis is arguing in this article is that Trump isn't really trying to convince people of the truth of these things, which would be communicative action. What he's doing is essentially an exercise of power. He is making an assertion that he can say whatever he wants, and nobody can stop him, right? That he has power over the narrative in society, and the institutions that traditionally would hold up a hand and say, no, you cannot say this because it's not true, that they have no power to stop him. And Tallis goes on to argue that in the past, this may have worked relatively well because people identified with Trump's contempt for certain kinds of elites and also his will to power. They identified with his will to power. But, he argues, many people are beginning to waver and to feel that Trump is expressing contempt for them as well in the kinds of statements that he is making. So his power is beginning to fade. And a third factor that I want to talk about here, I should move on, I think, is polarization. So this is a kind of a summary of the factors that are involved in the diffusion of information: technological factors, social media and algorithms, the strategies of political elites, and then finally, polarization. Post-truth culture and its purely instrumental view of communication grows where political camps are strongly hostile to one another, and victory over the political adversary is seen as overriding other values. One element of this culture of political polarization is the belief that belief in particular narratives comes to be seen more as a statement of political identity, a statement of identification with a particular political camp than an evaluation of factual accuracy, right? So people believe these stories about the Haitian immigrants because it fits with their identity, with their political identity. It's a kind of a solidarity among a political group, and this is partly why post-truth culture becomes consolidated. Now here, when we get to polarization, this brings us to the final thing that I want to talk about here, which is populism. Clearly, the elites who circulate this kind of misinformation are in many cases populists, right? Like Trump and Bolsonaro. And in general, it's part of the literature on populism that part of the strategy of populism is polarization, right? This is how populism succeeds in many cases politically, is by polarizing. So what Trump and Bolsonaro did during the pandemic was, rather than trying to bring the community together around a response to the pandemic, was to use the pandemic to promote their narrative of a conflict between the people and the elites. And it's in this context that misinformation circulated. So populism is certainly an important factor, and these elites also used elements of the broader culture of populism, the suspicion particularly of expert knowledge and so on. This was very important to their political discourses. You may remember the British politician, you know, defending Brexit, attacking the economists and saying the people are tired of experts, right? So this is a manifestation also of populism. I would caution, though, and I'll finish up with this, that I think we should not go too far in identifying populism as the root cause of this spread of misinformation. I tend to agree with Laclau that populism is not necessarily a political evil. Not all populism is illiberal, for example, and certainly not all populism is associated with post-truth culture. In the case of COVID, by the way, populist leaders around the world made many different decisions about how to handle the pandemic, and not all of them operated in the same way as Trump and Bolsonaro. So I think that there's lots of different forms of populism, and I also think that, am I running out of time here? This post-truth culture is often much broader than populism. I wrote an article recently with two colleagues who study Latin America, who focus on both Argentina and Ecuador, about anti-populism in the media and the media in Latin America. And one of the arguments that we make in this article is that in Latin America, anti-populist politics is often a kind of mirror image of populism and uses a lot of the same strategies as anti-populism, including misinformation, right, and including the general kind of strategic orientation toward communication as essentially a weapon of political war. In this case, justified by the argument that, well, populists are anti-democratic, illegitimate actors, and therefore we cannot, we cannot give credibility to their point of view. We must struggle against them, right? So in terms of journalism, there's a shift toward a sort of war journalism against populist leaders. So the problem of post-truth is broader than merely populism. And when we think about polarization and where does it come from, yes, polarization is definitely associated with the rise of populism. But I think there's an important question about which causes which, and a broader context that's important to keep in mind about the rise of both of them, polarization and populism. And here, when I think about both Latin America, which I study, and the United States, I think the key thing here is and I think this applies to Europe as well, the incredible rise in inequality over the past decades. And the associated breakdown in social solidarity that was connected with the welfare state in places where that existed, and so on. I think that polarization is ultimately rooted in that rise in inequality and the feeling of large parts of the population that there isn't the kind of social solidarity that there once was in the past. So in that sense, we can perhaps add to the list of things that are associated here, disinformation, post-truth culture, populism, polarization, neoliberalism, right, which is at the root of a lot of this decline of the old political culture of trust, in which there was, at least modestly, a greater respect for norms of communicative action that are now breaking down. And I'll stop with that.